no true knight among you!
There is a comforting lie at the heart of modern storytelling. It tells us that no one is truly good or evil, that all people are fundamentally the same. And if we only understand where someone is coming from, then with enough empathy, context, and explanation, even the worst actions dissolve into tragedy rather than condemnable guilt. It is a claim that feels compassionate. It has also quietly hollowed out our moral imagination, reducing entertainment into the same broad story experience for over 2 decades. If we want to understand why modern storytelling converges on the same conclusions, then we have to understand the philosophical conditions that make those conclusions feel not only acceptable, but inevitable. So this essay is not ultimately about stories alone. It is an examination of the world that produces them, the world it insists on, and that moral climate's effects. While formulating my thoughts and response, A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms arrived on HBO. So, to understand how we got here and how we might escape a sea of familiar storytelling cliches, we'll use the world and work of George R.R. Martin as both our mirror and means of dissection. Martin's beloved series A Song of Ice and Fire presents itself as fantasy realism, a work that rejects moral idealism in favour of what it claims is a more honest reflection of the real world. It is fantasy grounded in brutality, cynicism and bloodshed, and loved precisely because it feels true. And it is from his claim of realism that we gain license to interrogate Martin's work not merely as fiction, but as an advancement of philosophy, reflection of the present-day West, and therein, the stories it tells. Because if A Song of Ice and Fire is meant to reflect the real world, then it necessarily reflects the moral and ideological paradigm in which it was written, one forged in the aftermath of World War II, into which Martin was born, educated, and through which his worldview was shaped. And Martin has told us as much. I was born 3 years after the end of World War II. You want to be a hero. You want to stand up, whether you're Spider-Man fighting the Green Goblin, or the Americans saving the world from the Nazis. It's sad to say, but I do think there are things worth fighting for. Men are still capable of great heroism, but I don't necessarily think there are heroes. So Westeros did not emerge from nothing. It emerged from the same philosophical climate that has dominated the latter half of the 20th century and continues into our own. And within A Song of Ice and Fire, Martin advances several core claims that mirror those made by modern Western society. The first is moral relativism, the belief that there are no good or evils, only people shaped by circumstance, and with sufficient understanding and context, moral judgment dissolves. The second is universalism, that people are all fundamentally the same, seeking the same things, and that beneath surface differences lies a shared moral framework waiting to be reconciled through understanding. And third is a deep suspicion of power itself, the belief that the will to power is inherently corrupting, and that those who wield power must be morally suspect, if not outright dangerous. Together, they form the philosophical bedrock of A Song of Ice and Fire, a world where moral clarity is treated as naivety, honour as a liability, and power quickly indistinguishable from tyranny. It is a world that insists realism requires the abandonment of moral ideals. To be clear on my personal position, this is not a case against compassion or understanding. And yet, on inspection, this trinity of ideas creates a world functionally incapable of identifying evil and defending anything meaningful at all. How then did they come to be our status quo? In the aftermath of World War II, Western leaders looked on Nazism and concluded the following things. First, that since the Nazis legitimized persecution based on group difference, acknowledging meaningful differences must itself be made illegitimate. Second, that if differences cannot be acknowledged, then all people must be treated as fundamentally the same in their outlook, values, and motivations. Third, that since Hitler sought and used power to commit atrocities, the will to power itself must be viewed as inherently dangerous. And fourth, as the Nazis sought to advance their national interests, nationalism must itself be suspect and actively stymied because it was feared as an inevitable sentimental precursor to the emergence of a Fourth Reich. This post-war consensus has been the intellectual glue binding Western thought and policy for 80 years, increasingly eroding and invalidating opposition on moral grounds across politics, culture, and entertainment. In the aftermath of World War II in particular, those seem like a noble, stabilizing and sensible set of ideas to orient a peaceful New World Order around. But the truth is they always came with a crucial dependency. They were upheld not by moral persuasion alone, but by overwhelming American military and economic power. American power was the metaphorical but also literal parent, forcibly keeping squabbling children in check, threatening to deny them the things that they wanted if they didn't set aside their differences and get along. Power, in other words, was never absent, it was simply externalized. And this is the contradiction at the heart of the modern moral order and the lie that we've set out to expose. For power, contrary to modern storytelling's insistence, is fundamental to any idea of good surviving at all. One of the central claims of moral relativism is that since every person has the capacity for both good and evil, there can ultimately be no such thing as true good or evil, that with sufficient context, understanding and sympathy, all moral claims dissolve. But critical reflection reveals that this idea does not eliminate evil, nor can it stop atrocities occurring. On the contrary, it can only ever react after evil acts have occurred and ultimately be used to excuse them. If we define evil as outcomes that result in the destruction, subjugation, or dehumanization of others, then it follows that not all moral frameworks are equally good, regardless of whether actions can be excused by context, because morality does not emerge from intentions alone. It emerges from paradigms, belief systems that define what is good, what is bad, what is permitted, and what must be opposed. Ideas form belief systems generate values, and values drive actions. And while human beings are all certainly born equal, ideas are certainly not. It cannot possibly, therefore, be the case that all ideas are all morally good, because moral goodness itself is contingent on the paradigm through which it's defined. Many good actions are mutually incompatible on moral grounds. The paradigm and perspective that we hold determines that judgment. And this means that judgment is not an unfortunate byproduct of morality that we get to sidestep. Judgment is the primary mechanism by which morality can exist at all. Good can only be good in opposition to something else. Virtue can only be virtuous if there is something it refuses to tolerate.
I'm going to hear you confess before you die. You raped my sister. You murdered her. You killed her children. Say it now and we can make this quick.
Without judgment, there is no moral clarity, and without moral clarity, there's nothing worth standing for if everything is equally desirable, then nothing is more repulsive or repugnant than anything else. To refuse to judge, therefore, is not to be morally enlightened, it is to abdicate moral responsibility. And this is not just a philosophical problem, it has narrative consequences. A culture that treats judgment as dangerous gradually loses the ability to tell meaningful stories about good and evil at all. At this point, it's worth clarifying that I'm not making a defense of rigid moral absolutism, nor a claim that every moral judgment must be enforced with blind certainty or ideological zeal. Moral clarity is not the same thing as moral infallibility. What moral relativism denies is not certainty, but legitimacy, the legitimacy of judgment itself. The choice is not between tyranny and tolerance, it's between a moral framework willing to judge and defend itself and one that abdicates that responsibility. A Song of Ice and Fire systematically dissolves the category of moral absolutes by contextualizing every action until hero and villain collapse into circumstance. In his work, Martin seeks to make us constantly aware of his characters' personal contexts, diminishing their otherwise outwardly evil acts through increased understanding. But Duncan the Tool has a code, and through it, moral clarity, so Duncan the Tool does not care.
When he was dying, he called for his long sword, bade me kneel. Charged me to be a good knight, to defend the weak and the innocent. Serve the realm with all my might, and I swore that I would.
Duncan is Martin's own counterexample, not as an abstract moral ideal, but as a lived alternative, a man who insists that understanding evil does not excuse it, that some things are wrong regardless of context, and that honour consists of the willingness to bear the cost of acting on that belief. Dunk does not ask, what do I feel? He asks, what does my moral duty require? And then he accepts whatever consequence the actions of his verdict dictate. Of course, history is littered with atrocities committed in the name of moral certainty. That danger is definitely real. The answer to that danger is not moral paralysis, but moral ownership, the refusal to outsource the consequences of one's convictions to others.
When you think of Chairman Mao, do you think he is always right, or can he sometimes be wrong?
Yes, our great leader Chairman Mao is always right.
Duncan represents this opposite principle, not ideology enforced from above, but moral conviction embodied from below. He does not outsource the repercussions of judgment, he carries them himself. Duncan functions as a modern parable because he shows us that moral collapse does not happen when values disappear, but when the price of upholding them becomes something that too many people choose not to pay. A society unwilling to decide which moral framework it is prepared to defend will always be defeated by one that is. Because any system that is willing to enforce its version of good through unity, sacrifice, and power will inevitably dominate one that has rendered itself morally diffuse and operationally weak. History does not show us that understanding inevitably leads to moral alignment. Actually, it shows us the opposite, that competing belief systems produce competing moral outcomes, most of which result in oppression, domination, and ultimately death. And ideologies do not collapse because they are understood better. They collapse because they're defeated with power. Any ideology willing to use power to enforce its version of what is morally right will triumph over an ideology that has rendered itself powerless in the name of tolerance. This should be obvious, and even Christianity, the moral root of the Western striving for tolerance and forgiveness, survived for centuries only because it recognized this reality. In Scripture, Christ tells his followers that two swords are enough. One spiritual to guard faith and conscience, and one physical. For without the defense of the physical body, ideals of forgiveness, brotherhood, and moral restraint could not survive contact with a violent world. A culture that insists on moral relativism, that refuses to name evil for fear of appearing judgmental and rejects the power to oppose it, does not become compassionate because it necessarily becomes willingly permissive of evil acts. This is the truth that modern liberal storytelling simply cannot admit. Power and judgment are not the enemies of morality. Judgment is required to define evil, and power is the necessary mechanism by which morality survives contact with it. It wouldn't have mattered that Hitler was morally reprehensible or that the Allies stood for our definition of the moral good. Without the Allies' military and industrial power to oppose him and the courage to sacrifice to do so, no matter how well we understood Weimar Germany and Hitler's personal context, evil would have triumphed. Understanding does not excuse evil. I can understand Ayatollah Khomeini's beliefs and still conclude he is objectively evil based on our earlier definition, and so too are his ideas. When a society abandons a shared moral foundation and binding culture of values and refuses to enforce its values for that fear of judgment, all that remains are ever-tightening rules designed to keep competing paradigms in check. And when evil is encountered but not condemned, because condemnation carries reputational or professional cost, evil flourishes unbound. This is not the only way a moral order collapses, but it is one of them. Another is when a society possesses a shared moral code but quietly abandons it whenever enforcement becomes personally costly. This is the world Martin crafted. Not one without moral codes, Westeros possesses a binding monoculture, its religion of the Seven and a shared language of honour, duty and virtue. But it is a world in which those codes, though widely recognised, are routinely abandoned when enforcing them carries personal cost.
Commander! Take the Queen and her children into custody. Escort them back to the royal apartments and keep them there, under guard.
Men of the watch!
I want no bloodshed. Tell your men to lay down their swords. No one needs to die.
I did warn you not to trust me.
Whether a society lacks a shared moral foundation or possesses one but refuses to enforce it, the outcome is the same. Morality collapses into rule following, silence, and procedural evil. That is increasingly the world we live in now. And so what arises in our world, as in Westeros, is a society in which so long as rules go unbroken, evil acting within those rules can continue to go unpunished because there is no deeper moral foundation still treated as legitimate for holding evil actions to account. In such a world, morality therefore just becomes procedural. Goodness becomes synonymous with compliance. Virtue becomes reputation and a cloak to disguise self-interest. This is precisely the worldview that A Song of Ice and Fire embodies, a world in which honour is naive, risking any true personal cost for moral conviction is deathly foolish, and power belongs to those willing to abandon virtue first and say whatever is necessary to survive and advance. When moral standing is not derived from courage, accountability, or sacrifice, but from the adherence to rules, the persecution of dissent becomes inevitable. Those who maintain a rotten order come to see themselves as righteous, not merely because the system rewards them, but because dissent itself carries reputational risk. Morality becomes less about the good and more about avoiding social punishment. It flows from reputational paranoia. This then is not moral clarity, it is systemic moral cowardice, and we see it in the tourney crowd at Ashford Meadow who remain silent when Dunk cries out, "Are there no true knights among you?" In the nobles of Westeros too, who side with Aerion against him, breaking their word. These are not monsters. They are representatives of a system acting in self-preservation, obeying the rules as written, no matter how morally bankrupt those rules have become. Nowhere is this clearer than in Dunk's contrast with figures like Sir Stephen and Prince Aerion. Sir Stephen doesn't believe himself evil, he believes himself dutiful and pragmatic, but his duty is not to the good. It is to himself within a hierarchy, navigating its procedures and advancing within it, regardless of the corruption it upholds. It is against this world that Duncan the Tall cuts so sharply, and it's why Duncan the Tall cuts through. He lives in the same brutal, hierarchical, violent society as everyone else. What makes him different is the moral code he refuses to abandon, even when it risks costing him everything. Duncan does not ask whether standing up for the innocent is strategically wise or whether it will benefit him socially, and he doesn't care whether the institutions or lords around him approve. A hedge knight is the truest kind of knight, he is told by his mentor. Other knights serve the lords who keep them, but we serve where we will, for men whose causes we believe in. The hedge knight, such as Dunk is when we meet him, is therefore dangerous precisely because he is not owned. His morality is not to be outsourced. His honour is not contingent on approval. He cannot be compromised. He acts because something is wrong, and wrongs must be resisted. This is not a case for vigilantism, nor a rejection of law, institutions, or restraint. Duncan is not a model for governance, but perhaps he is a case for moral agency. Systems matter. Law matters, but they fail when individuals abdicate responsibility and hide behind the procedure we've discussed. The danger is not action without limits, but obedience without conscience. And this is precisely what Dunk exposes. When Dunk strikes Prince Aerion, it's not because he's impulsive or because violence has overtaken him, but because something intolerable is happening in front of him. A girl is being brutalized, power is being abused, and everyone else is pretending not to see. This moment matters because it exposes the lie at the center of moral relativism, that if moral judgment is suspended indefinitely, evil is never effectively confronted. If enforcement is abdicated, cruelty becomes laissez-faire. Judgment does not, nor should it necessarily, culminate in violence, but it always carries the possibility of consequence. Dunk's violence is not the point. His refusal to look away is. The refusal to enforce any boundary, physical, social, or institutional, is not restraint, it is tantamount to surrender. Honour gets Dunk imprisoned, beaten, and nearly killed because enforcing a moral code demands a cost and somebody willing to pay it. Power without clarity is monstrous, but moral clarity without power is just useless. Dunk is not opposed to power, he's opposed to power's abuse. He understands something that modern storytelling increasingly refuses to admit aloud, that without the will to enforce moral claims, physically, socially, or institutionally, moral claims then just collapse into sentiment. We've seen Duncan before in a different body with a different name, Ned Stark. But in Ned's case, he was used to launch Martin's philosophy onto the world stage. The execution of Ned Stark and the Red Wedding scenes were not merely shocking plot twists, they were philosophical statements used to espouse the core ideas that we've covered so far. That goodness does not survive contact with reality, belief in honour is just foolish, and survival belongs to the cynical.
You don't fight with honour.
No. He did.
It is a fundamentally depressing worldview, where evil triumphs because morals are as fickle as the wind, and if there is an ideal at all, where self-interest seems considered paramount. At its core then, Martin's world stages a dialectical conflict between selfishness and self-sacrifice, embodied in Duncan and Ned on one side, and the broader ensemble of Westeros on the other. The choice being dramatised is to offer oneself up for the good of others, or to elevate one's own ideas as the highest ideal, but either way, there is an ideal. Whether we admit it or not, every society decides what it believes is ultimately necessary, literally the ideal outcome actions should orient towards. In doing so, it decides its fate. So the question is simple. What sustains a preferable civilization, self-interest or self-sacrifice? Look at Westeros and decide. This is ultimately a question about honour and duty themselves, where we place them in the hierarchy of moral virtues. Is duty owed only to the self, or found in the bonds between you, your land and history, your moral code and web of relationships? In real life, we live in the tension between self-preservation, status-seeking, and ideals we rarely live up to because of pragmatic constraints. So when we see or read of people who pursue and sacrifice for the ideal, for honour and duty, like Duncan the Tall, we acknowledge how difficult that truly is for most of us, and that they do it anyway is the essence of what makes them noble. The brutal realism of a Game of Thrones may thrill us, but once the shock fades, it leaves behind a grim philosophy. Without a moral ideal to strive toward, the world offers no aspiration beyond survival and accumulated power, governed by tightening doctrines imposed from above. If this sounds familiar, it should. Duncan is the fizzing antidote to this philosophy. He is the silhouette that turns to his creator and says, liar. He draws a line in the sand here and no further, and we love him for it, because he is good. And his goodness is in his striving to live up to the ideal of honour and moral virtue, regardless of the rules of his world or his place in its ranks. And so we love him, because we know our world and leaders let honour wither on the vine long ago. At this point, a likely objection is that this is an overreading of Martin's intentions, that I am projecting coherence or ideological conflict where none really exists. But Martin has been unusually explicit about his philosophical commitments. He has repeatedly expressed distrust of heroism, rejection of moral absolutes, and skepticism towards honour being a virtue. In his well-known remarks on Lord of the Rings, Martin rejects heroes like Aragorn, heroes who are good and who succeed because goodness itself is treated as determining destiny. Now, this objection is not without merit, and a world in which goodness guarantees victory is not real. But victory is not the right metric for determining goodness in the first place, and Martin's reading is not the only definition of heroism available to us even within the fantasy world. The heroic fantasy author David Gemmell once argued that a hero does not require a quest, a prophecy, a crown, a sword. A hero is simply someone who does something heroic, even just once, regardless of who they are or what they have done before. By this definition, heroism is not a state of being, but an act, not moral purity, but moral choice under personal cost.
I remember Dave Gemmell saying to me one evening, he asked me what I thought a hero was, and I floundered rather a lot, and he said a hero is just somebody who's done something heroic. He may not be the guy in the white hat, he might not be somebody you would want to go to the pub with.
And by that definition, Boromir is heroic because of his final choice and actions, despite his intentions and character up to that point. To distrust this form of heroism is not to reject fantasy, but to distrust courageous self-sacrifice itself. And to decide whether such acts can even be called heroic at all, one must first accept a moral paradigm capable of judgment, which Martin's broader philosophy rejects. This moral vacancy is often defended as if judgment itself were childish. But the deeper issue is not judgment alone, it is the refusal to see judgment through. Modern stories are often willing to name evil, but unwilling to act on that naming beyond just a moral commentary, some kind of therapy, or hoped for redemption.
You've got to do better, Senator. You've got to step up.
This reluctance rests on the universalist assumption that all people ultimately share the same moral code, and that therefore once confronted with their wrongdoing, they will recognize it, repent, and reform. But as we've already discussed, that assumption does not hold with how we know that paradigms work. This resistance to showing judgment embodied and enacted is also a recent storytelling habit, it's not an eternal truth. Clint Eastwood's Unforgiven is brutal, bleak, and unsparing, yet it insists on judgment. William Money is certainly no hero in the traditional sense, but he has a code. A wrong is done, a line is drawn, and when he acts, he sees it through and bears the cost himself. This tradition of moral action grounded in personal code rather than moral consensus runs through earlier, also widely admired storytelling. In 12 Angry Men, a single juror refuses both social pressure and procedural convenience, accepting isolation in order to see his moral judgment through. In To Kill a Mockingbird, Atticus Finch does not expect enlightenment to redeem his community. He acts from duty, knowing it will cost him status, safety, and peace. And in Schindler's List, moral action emerges not from purity or agreement, but from costly choices repeatedly made in stark defiance of the surrounding moral order and social consensus. What these stories share is not certainty nor comfort, but commitment. They don't assume moral truth enforces itself, they require someone to embody it. Unforgiven makes this explicit. The film does not excuse violence, it makes its price unmistakable. What it refuses to dissolve is responsibility into systems, trauma, or endless understanding.
You just shot an unarmed man.
Well, he should have armed himself. He's gonna decorate his saloon with my friend.
Judgment is not clean, but it is unavoidable, and the willingness to stand behind it rather than hide from it is precisely what most modern stories have lost. Duncan the Tall strides into this absence, and this is where Martin's own work begins to betray him too, because in A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms, Martin is conceding that there is in fact a heroic and moral ideal, and he gives us good cause to suspect that the side he has secretly chosen is not the cynical, morally devoid belief of no goods or evils, of moral relativism and self-interest, the lifeblood of A Song of Ice and Fire. For Duncan is a hero because he stands for the moral heroic ideal, and he is not destroyed by his honour in the way Martin casually insists such men must be. This tension may also explain why Martin cannot finish his series, because to do so he would have to choose to either end with evil triumphing, thereby endorsing a world where that outcome is acceptable based on his philosophies, or concede that if moral good exists and can prevail because it should, then there are ideals and ways of being that are noble, and those who embody them deserve the better thereafter. And this cuts across the grain of all he's set up. And that tension is not confined to Westeros. A culture that cannot judge for fearing backlash cannot tell meaningful stories, only variations of the same psychological autopsy. Every villain must be explained, every crime contextualized, every act dissolved into systems, incentives, trauma, and circumstance, and so every story collapses into the same moral flatline. We're all the same, we must not judge, power should be avoided, tolerance is paramount, and thus no one is ever truly responsible for anything they do, and therefore no actions are really ever followed through. This is also why so many modern stories feel totally interchangeable, because once judgment is removed and power delegitimized, conflict just becomes cosmetic. Different settings, different aesthetics, but the same conclusion every time. Understanding replaces action, and sympathy replaces condemnation. Duncan the Tall is dangerous because he breaks this spell. He isn't always stronger, smarter, or more powerful than those around him, but he stands apart because he is willing to judge and then to act on that judgment, regardless of the consequences or cost. He refuses to outsource his morality to institutions, rules, crowds, or reputation. The tawny crowd stays silent not because they're ignorant, they know what's going on, they know what's right, but standing with Duncan would cost them something. And that makes their silence the true villain of that scene. To tell Duncan's story honestly is to evoke something deeply uncomfortable to modern storytelling and Western liberal society. That evil does not persist because it's misunderstood, but because too few people are willing to stand against it if the crowd isn't already on their side. It is to declare that moral clarity is not naive. Honour is not obsolete, and true courage is not symbolic, but costly, and the cost is why it matters. In the end, it's not really just a question of taste. It's asking us to reflect on the type of people our stories are shaping us to become, because a person is the stories they tell themselves, and a society is the same. A world that teaches us that judgment is unacceptable will raise generations unable to defend anything, paralysed by ever-deepening understanding. A culture that treats honour as foolish will simply be governed by crooks, and a society that confuses compassion with permissiveness will eventually find itself in hell. So Duncan the Tall cuts through because he forces us to confront something we all secretly already know, but rarely admit. That morality without enforcement is just sentiment, compassion without conviction collapses into complicity, and that any goodness which cannot defend or enforce itself simply will not survive. That's why his challenge still echoes.
And they're no no true knight among you!
Because the question was never just meant for Westeros. It was for us.